Question: is the speed limit sign that you see a command or a suggestion? We'll have an invitation song a little bit later in case. Sometimes we're driving along. To me, it's always been Catalina Road. You're driving down this long, wide, completely straight road, and yet you're only supposed to go 25. The car doesn't want to go 25. It's silly that you can only go 25. Then on Lucas Creek, there's a speed limit that's either 25 or 35, depending on which way you're going. And again, it's just hard to go that slow. Some laws are just silly. But here's a couple of examples. In Missouri, it's illegal. There's a state law against driving your car with a bear inside. So keep that in mind if you visit Missouri. In Maine, it's illegal to keep up Christmas decorations after January 14th. I have several neighbors that would go to jail if that were the state law in Virginia. In Connecticut, you can't call a pickle unless it bounces. That's kind of an interesting state law. Also, Connecticut, it's illegal to walk across the street on your hands. I just would love the process as the legislators are discussing that law, why that had to be necessary. In Louisiana, it's illegal to order a surprise pizza for one of your friends. And in Alaska, it's illegal to wake up a sleeping bear for a photo op. It's not just illegal, it could be the last thing that you ever do. But it's interesting, some of those laws are so silly, and you got to wonder, and yet if you knew the story behind them, they would probably make a lot of sense. I imagine in Louisiana, there was a raft of practical jokers who would order 15 pizzas and give somebody else's address until finally the legislator had to say, if the person that the pizza is being delivered to doesn't know that it's coming, it's illegal to order pizzas. That makes sense. And then I'm sure there was some pickle counterfeiting going on. There were pickles that didn't have enough brine or something. And so if a pickle wasn't prepared in such a way that it really was a pickle, and the best way to test it is you throw it down. If it bounces, then it's got enough pickle in it to be a pickle. Now, as far as a bear riding in your car, I got nothing on that one. I don't get that one at all. But you'd be interested to know the story behind it. We continue this morning with our look at the book of Exodus, and we're sort of making a shift in the book. If you've read through the book, you know my process in thinking, okay, where am I going to go from here? It's been said that Leviticus is where daily Bible programs go to die. Well, there's a section of Exodus that sounds just like Leviticus, sort of giving a preview to get you ready for when you start with all of the laws and various things in Leviticus. And so I thought, okay, maybe I'll skip that part. And then a little bit later in Leviticus, there is this long section on the preparations that were made for the construction of the tabernacle. And then a little bit later, there is the details of when they put all that into practice and actually built the tabernacle. And so I thought maybe I'll just skip that part, just observe the Passover and go on to the interesting stories that follow about the golden calf and the aftermath of that where God decides to destroy the people of Israel and Moses intervenes. Those are all interesting stories. But then I decided, well, if I observe the Passover, the part that talks about the Passover is in that section that I would be passing over. So maybe what I will do is this, and this is what I'm going to do. We're going to take today to look at that section of laws that immediately follow the giving of the Ten Commandments. And then next week, we'll just do an overview of what Exodus says about the tabernacle. And that's how we're going to deal with that. So today we're going to look at some silly laws. There's some laws that are given in Exodus that just seem like it has no application whatsoever to us today. For example, Exodus 21 and verse 2. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he is to serve for 6 years. Okay? And then in Exodus 21, you are to take an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Now, some of us are tempted to respond in that way when somebody gets on our nerves, but we realize that's not directly for us. And then, what's the deal with Exodus 23 and verse 19? Do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. kind of interesting. But what does all of that have to do with us? We understand that the law that was given to the Jews several times, multiple times in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. God says specifically that my covenant is with Israel. My covenant is with the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so the law that's given was specifically given to the Israelite people. And so we are, sometimes we just want to dismiss everything that follows as not applying to us at all. And so we're just going to skip this part. But indeed, the part that, the point is that God was revealing himself in the law, that God was showing himself to Israel. And though the specifics of these commands might not apply to us, the revelation of God, there are principles involved. And so what we want to do is we want to look at those three laws that we just mentioned that seem silly on the surface, but which may have principles that we need to apply today. So the first one was, why does Moses seem to approve of slavery? In Exodus 21, verse 2, when you buy a Hebrew slave, he is to serve for 6 years. Then in the seventh, he is to leave as a free man without paying anything. If he arrives alone, he is to leave alone. If he arrives with a wife, his wife is to leave with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children belong to her master, and the man must leave alone. It's interesting, isn't it, that right after the Exodus, right after the children of Israel leave, they go through the little wilderness thing, they end up at Sinai, and God gives the law. The very first law that God mentions after the Ten Commandments is about slavery. I mean, Israel had just spent over 400 years in slavery. And so the first thing that God mentions is what happens if you buy a Hebrew slave. That is kind of interesting. And back in the 1800s, when the people were beginning to oppose the practice of slavery in this country, the abolitionist movement was driven by people who were Christians, people who were driven by their faith positions. And their faith positions were driven by the large strokes of Scripture, where God tells us to the golden rule, to treat other people as we would want to be treated. He tells us the second great command, love your neighbor as yourself. He tells us that Jesus tore down the wall of partition so that there is no longer slave or free, Jew or Gentile, male or female, all are one in Christ Jesus. And they pointed to these texts as proof why slavery should be abolished. Interestingly enough, many of the people that were pro-slavery also pointed to Scripture. And what they pointed to was texts like ones we just read that talk about why that God allowed slavery in the Old Testament, that Paul told slaves in the New Testament to obey their masters. Unfortunately, we have people today that want to point to those same texts as a way of trying to downplay the seriousness and the evilness of slavery as practiced in the American past. And to deny that there's any sort of legacy of evil that were left over in a systemic way because of slavery. But understand that the slavery that Moses is talking about in Exodus is so far different from the slavery that existed in the American past. In fact, this slavery was put in place as a safeguard for the poor, that when somebody became poor, they were able to sell themselves into slavery. So in Leviticus 25, verse 39, if any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. In other words, don't treat them as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. When people lived as farmers, particularly as they moved into this new country where they're going to have to make a living for themselves, a whole new life for themselves, a poor farmer was just one disaster away from complete and total being destitute. If rain came at the wrong time, or too much rain came, or no rain at all came, then you lost an entire crop, and then you had nothing which to prepare for the next year, and nothing to eat during the wintertime. And so this system was put into place so that you could sell yourself as a slave. You're actually bought by someone, but the system wasn't that you were owned. The system was that you were indentured to someone else. They told you when to get up and when to go to bed. They had complete financial control over you, but you were not to be treated as a hired worker or as a temporary resident. The Israelite slave was not less than. Because you see, he was going to be freed in 6 years. All the slaves were freed at the year of Jubilee and in the Sabbath year. You were enslaved, yes, but as a way to protect yourself against becoming completely destitute and starving to death. But when you went into slavery, you gave up your freedom, you gave up your independence, but you did not give up your citizenship in Israel. Masters were told that these slaves are going to go free, and so you don't treat them as slaves, you treat them as hired people. You understand that even though they are beneath you in the social strata, they are just as important in God's order of things, and one day they will be full citizens of Israel again. I think that's something that we need to remember in our culture today, that no one is less than in God's view of things. That the person that is homeless and has no financial fallback at all, who is reduced to living on the streets and seeking help where they can find it, that person is just as important to God as we all are. There is no one that is less than because of their social standing. No one that is less than because of their finances. No one that is less than because of their ethnic background. No one is less than. We are all children of God through His creation and children of God by faith through Jesus. And therefore, no one is to be treated as less important than anyone else. And I think Moses is reminding the children of Israel of that. Of course, they forgot that quite quickly. The second question that arises, the second law that we run into in the first part of this section is about how we respond. Moses seems completely at odds with Jesus here. He says in Exodus 21, verse 23, but if there's a serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. That's quite specific, isn't it? That we are to respond. Jesus tells us just the opposite in the Sermon on the Mount, right? When somebody strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other. If someone wants you to go 1 mile, go with him another. If somebody wants your coat, give him your shirt off your back. Right? We are to not respond in kind. So why does Moses seem to tell us that it's okay for the Israelites, if somebody pokes them in the eye, they'll poke them right back? Well, I think perhaps we have misunderstood what Moses was saying all along. In fact, that's exactly what Jesus is saying in the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard it said by those of old. Moses never said that you were responding kind. Moses was setting up a legal system whereby there was a reciprocity involved. If you were guilty of a crime, then whatever harm you caused was your punishment for the crime. So in Leviticus 25, as Leviticus again explains a little further as to what Moses was talking about in Exodus, anyone who takes the life of a human being is to be put to death. Anyone who takes the life of someone's animal must make restitution, life for life. Anyone who injures their neighbor is to be injured in the same manner, fracture for fracture, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. The one who has inflicted the injury must suffer the same injury. So what he's talking about is the legal system that emphasizes reciprocity. Whatever harm you cause is to be inflicted as punishment when you're found guilty by the community. This is not acting on one's own to repay vengeance for someone who, this is the punishment. So if you steal an ox, then you've got to give the ox back once you're caught. Plus, you've got to give 4 more oxen to pay for the one you took. It's a property crime. Inflicts property crime. In other cultures around Israel, somebody that stole an ox would be put to death, or maybe they would have their hand chopped off. But in Israel, the punishment always fits the crime. What happens if you steal an ox and you don't have 4 oxen to pay the fine? Well, that's a situation where you have to be sold into slavery and spend 7 years working for someone else to work off your debt. So the punishment always fits the crime. Moses is not saying God does not allow us to respond in kind. Paul tells us that we are to repay evil with good. We are not to return evil for evil, but rather we are to overcome evil by the good that we do. We are not to worry about seeking vengeance because vengeance belongs to God. We are to trust God enough to know that He is going to bring justice and not to seek it for our own. We are to leave room for the vengeance of God, Paul says. So it's never the right thing to respond in kind. And Moses even didn't intend that in the Old Testament once we understand that perfectly. Okay, so what about this goat thing? What is the point of Moses? Oh yeah, by the way, don't boil a young goat in its mother's milk. When I was a kid, I remember the King James of this. Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And I was a kid, so I kind of took that kind of personally. So what is the point of that law? Well, we need to understand that Moses is talking about in this section the various major festivals of the Jews. There's the festival of unleavened bread, the festival of harvest, and the festival of ingathering, which we normally call Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. These were the main festivals, and he gives a little bit of information about each one there in Exodus 23. Now, the details of each one of these is going to be gone over again and again in Leviticus, but he just gives an overview of these major festivals. And then he sums up with this section in Exodus 23 and verse 17. 3 times a year, all the men are to appear before the sovereign Lord. And all the men of Israel were supposed to come to wherever the temple was, or the tabernacle was, rather, to observe these major festivals. Do not offer the blood of a sacrifice to me along with anything containing yeast. There were grain offerings, but remember, during these festivals, you don't offer those grain offerings with yeast in them. The fat of my festival offerings must not be kept until morning. Bring the best of the first fruits of your soil to the house of the Lord your God, and then do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. Okay, this is giving instructions of how they are to observe. And what we'll find all through the law is that there are warnings of mixing the worship of God along with pagan rituals. And it seems that cooking a goat in its mother's milk was one of those pagan rituals that they were going to run into in Canaan if they hadn't run into it already. And so the warning here is don't allow there to be a mixing of these commandments of keeping God's law and his ritual festivals. Don't mix that in with things you may have been used to in Egypt or things you're going to run into in Canaan. You worship God exactly as he has commanded. A lot of the laws that we run into that we wonder about that seem to have no point, seem to be silly, exactly make this point about keeping the worship of God free from pagan influence. Don't trim the side of your beard. That's what pagan priests did in order to show which god it was that they were serving. Or don't get tattoos or body markings. Again, that was a pagan practice. Or, again, to demonstrate the purity of their devotion to God. Don't mix fabrics. You can't have a wool-cotton blend. They have to be pure. And there were certain foods that weren't to eat, like shellfish. What we do when we run across these things in the Old Testament, we like to kind of pick and choose which ones we're going to take seriously, right? So, we're not going to take seriously the command about not eating shellfish. Lynn broke that law yesterday. She had a crab cake. Well, we don't observe that when we go out to a seafood restaurant. By the way, according to the Jewish practice of this, don't boil a kid in his mother's milk, that's where they get the idea that you're not supposed to have a cheeseburger. In Orthodox Judaism, you can't mix meat and dairy together. You run the command, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk, through 300 years of rabbinic ramblings, and that's what you come up with. You can't eat meat and milk in the same meal. So we pick and choose these laws. As a father, I used to kind of like that one about not getting tattoos. I would like to quote that one to my daughters, don't get tattoos. But we understand that these, you can't just pick and choose these laws. All of these laws are emphasizing the same principle to us. We can't mix the way of the world with the way of God. We understand that as we learn, as we grow, as we study, as we come to know God better and better, that maybe we'll change our views on what it means to be holy like God is holy. When I grew up, it was a lot of, it was a list of things that you couldn't do to show you the holiness. You can't dance or drink or smoke or, a big long list for some people that included going to the movies or playing cards. Well, we sort of decided that, the list of things that we used to make is probably not the point of holiness. But understand, our God is still a holy God, and He wants us to live as holy people. And any time we live as friends of the world, we become the enemies of God, James tells us. So we need to understand that God calls us to be unblemished and not mixed with the ways of the world, to the point that we are His holy people, called out of the world to reflect His holiness. He says to us, just as He said to Israel, you shall be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am. So when you get a song stuck in your head and you can't get that song out of your head, well, I've got an earworm of a whole different variety going on. I have what's called musical hallucination. It's a form of tinnitus where, rather than just ringing in my ears, I've been hearing this soft music underneath the other noise that's always there, this soft music playing. Well, this past week, that just sort of random tones sort of coalesced. And for the past 4 days or so, I've constantly been hearing Amazing Grace playing in my head. Not imagining it, I'm hearing it's like a soft electric organ playing Amazing Grace. I'm just so glad it's not, bagpipes, playing. That would be kind of annoying. But I'm constantly reminded then of God's amazing grace. And I thought maybe somebody else this morning might need to be reminded of God's amazing grace. If you've been contemplating making a change in your life, if you're ready to name Jesus as your Savior, or if you've been struggling with something that you'd like to share with our elders, they'll be at the back of the auditorium as we sing this next song. And so as we sing about God's amazing grace, consider it. After this song, Perry will lead us in a closing prayer.
Amen.